Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Mr. Schwarzman for joining us at one of our alumni gatherings. It's a great pleasure to have you here tonight. As Salo said, I'm Venera Ziegler. I'm a partner at Torys in the New York office, and I work in fund formation, so we have exposure to Blackstone in certain situations. So, Mr. Schwarzman, to add to your many, many impressive achievements, you have now written What It Takes, Lessons in the Pursuit of Excellence. To me, the way I carry your book with me, to me your book is about the lessons you learn through very hard work and perseverance through your childhood, and then later on, the beginning of your career. And you took those lessons to establish Blackstone and to build Blackstone into one of the leading institutions it is today. We at Torys had the pleasure to work sometimes mostly across the table from Blackstone, and sometimes on the deals you talk about in the book, such as the sale of the risk management business of Thomson Reuters. And we have represented our clients, which are the world's leading institutional investors, in connection with the investment in the Blackstone Fund. So I'm really sorry for the long side letters that we've given you.
We do what we have to.
So before we dive into the book, my first question to you is, why did you decide to write the book, and what led you to it?
Sure, but let me just ask a question or two. It's nice to be here, and how many of you are practicing now? Okay, not that many. Looks like 15%, maybe 20%. I asked that because my wife's a lawyer, so you know, she said she's coming tonight, but as usual, she's not here yet.
She's dancing.
But she's heard me before, so this isn't an exclusive thing for her. So why did I do this? About 10 years ago, I guess, something like that, I got a call from Hank Paulson, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and Hank and I are friendly, and he had something he wanted to talk to me about, and then as he was signing off, he said, "By the way, you ought to write a book." I said, "Me?" I said, I don't have anything to say. He said, "You know, you really do." I said, "No, I don't." He said, "Even if you don't, you should keep notes and have some young journalists follow you around, take your calendars and, you know, just dictate some stuff if something interesting happened before you forget." So I said, all right, I did that for 2 years. Then I realized, why am I doing this? So, you know, we stopped and had a bunch of transcripts on things. And probably around 5 years ago or something, I was in the Middle East, and I was meeting with the head of a new head of one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. And, you know, he's a royal family person. And so I was accorded a 5-minute handshake. I was the first outsider he had met. And so if you're American, you have certain inherent advantages, which you can offend people even without trying. And so, you know, I was just sort of curious about him. So I said, "Hey, what have you been doing, you know, before you had this?" You know, he said, "Well, I'm like a royal family person." I said, "I know." I said, "But what have you been doing?" He said, "Well, I was running this other agency." I said, how was that?" He said, "Well, it was pretty interesting. It's my first job. And, you know, here's what I was thinking of doing." And I said, "So what are you going to do with this job?" He said, I'm not quite sure." He said, what do you think I ought to be doing?" So we finished talking 2.5 hours later. If you've ever been in this kind of setting, that, you know, if you've tied up the #1 guy in a closed room for 2.5 hours when they're expecting 5 minutes, they were just so relieved he was alive, you know, after this thing. And basically I went over all this stuff that's pretty easy for me. Here's how you run an organization, and, you know, here's how you look at investments, and, you know, here's how you look at something called asset allocation. It's just normal stuff. And so we had a really good dialogue. And okay, that was that. Sort of screwed up my day because I budgeted 5 minutes. And these types of things started happening to me all over the world where, I was trying to sell products. That's what business people do. In fact, I tried to sell him some stuff in the middle of the meeting, and he said, Mr. Schwarzman, please don't waste my time
I'll buy it anyway.
Trying to sell me a product because we're going to buy it anyhow. He said, all I want is to talk to you. So, okay. And then I started, I go around the world typically at different times. And, all of a sudden people were asking me all these things about how do you do stuff. And each one of these meetings would sort of run 2.5 hours, and it was scheduled for a lot less. By the time I did about 20 of these things, I said, oh my God, it's so tiresome that I'm just going to write a book. So when they asked a question, I can give them the book. So to show you how badly this worked, now I'm talking to you about the book. I don't even know you, right? So that's why I did it, because I've been doing stuff for a long time. I may look like I'm ancient, I feel like I'm 38, but I have accumulated experiences of, unfortunately, like decades. And I've learned a lot of stuff by making mistakes. That's the way you learn. It would be nice if you could just learn in school, right? And you got all the answers and you went out and you're like a master or mistress of the universe, and you don't make mistakes. For those of us, who, we lead life. We do things we've never done before, so your probability of being right in that kind of circumstance is pretty remote to have 100% correct stuff. So getting older and doing things is a trial and error type of knowledge building base, and I realized I'd like to share that with people so they could have an easier life, and they could also have the benefit of my mistakes and my scrambling and my figuring out like new paradigms, and so that's why I did it. I mean, it's the worst profit thing I've ever thought of in my life. It takes so long to write a book. I recommend you all never do it. And then you have to go around and schlep it. So it's I'm donating the money anyhow to something called the New Teacher Project, which is hiring outstanding people for public schools and training them and then placing them. So it's just like a gift from me to other people, so they can have an easier life and a more inspired one and accomplish stuff and all the good reasons you'd want to do something.
I wish I had read your book years ago. I would have advanced my career faster, for sure. Since you talk about mistakes, I was going to ask you this later, but since you talk about, you in the book, you emphasize many points about mistakes, rejections, failures. You talk about, like, there are moments when you talk about MIT, the book starts with MIT, and how you went there the first day on a Friday afternoon with Pete Peterson. It was raining, pouring, and you went there and knocked on the door, and it's like 3 o'clock, and you're waiting for the meeting, nobody's there. And then you saw a janitor, and janitor comes in and is like, oh, they all leave at 2 p.m. on Fridays, they're not going to be here. So that was a rejection. And one of my questions that I always wanted to ask you since I read the book was, how have you gotten comfortable with mistakes and rejections, and why are failures important?
Well, unfortunately, you don't learn anything by being successful. In other words, all you do is do the same thing over again. So there's not a lot of learning that goes with that. When you make a mistake, what happens? A normal human being likes to make pretend it didn't happen. Right. Particularly if you're working in an organization, right? Or you want to deal with it by blaming somebody. That's your best case, right? First, make pretend it didn't happen, and secondly, blame it on somebody else. But inevitably, you'll keep making some version of the same mistake. Why would you ever want to do that? So I think what you have to do, and particularly if you're an entrepreneur, you have no one to blame anything on other than yourself. You hired all these people. You know, you're supposed to have trained them. You're supposed to have, you know, some type of oversight, risk controls, whatever you call it. So, you know, I like to look at these things and force people to confront a mistake and say, what did we do wrong? You never want to get angry at somebody. If they're one of your people, that means you either hired the wrong person or you put them in the wrong position. It's not their fault, right? How do we have this never happen again? So if you live your life in a way where anything that's off gets corrected, not just that one time, but in terms of a change paradigm for how you or your organization or other people approach that identical type of thing, then you know you keep fixing things up so you don't make the same idiotic mistake. And what you'll find after a while, you just really stop making mistakes. And when you stop making mistakes, not all, but you don't make really big ones as you get older, by the way. You make your greatest mistakes when you're in your 30s, because that's the smartest you'll ever be. And the reason you know that is you just have to ask yourself, and you say, I am such a smart 32-year-old. I can do anything. And unfortunately, then they go and they do it. Right? And something really bad happens. It's hard in your 60s to really make bad mistakes because you learn too much. But what's important is institutionalizing how you look at things and never making somebody feel bad about making a mistake. You know, it's a learning experience.
When you talk about institutionalizing a mistake, Blackstone has never had any losses, barely had any losses. And I think there was one investment, I believe the third one, that you lost almost 100% of the investment. Yeah. That was a mistake, and that made you change. You saying it was a mistake, yeah. I wouldn't know, but it made you change the investment decision process at Blackstone, which is I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk, how do you manage that investment decision process where you're practically allowing everybody to express an opinion, to participate, and yet you maintain your position of very strong leadership in there?
Yeah, I made a really bad mistake on our third investment. I had never made investments. And, you know, I set out to raise the biggest first-time fund ever done. And, you know, if you like rejection as a person,
Who does?
Put yourself out there where you're almost completely unqualified and announce to the world you're going to raise, you know, the second biggest fund in the world, and go and do it and see what happens. And what happens is that 16 out of 17 people reject you. And the nice thing about these rejections, it's totally personal. They meet you, and it's like being Russell Crowe in Gladiator. They look at the emperor, and he goes down. So you know, we were rejected. I was rejected 16 out of 17 presentations, and I almost can't describe how awful that is. I'd had a lot of success in life, so I wasn't like, you know, people looking at me and, you know, saying you're a loser, and you know, these were people of all types, and we ended up raising the biggest first-time fund. It was $850 million. This is back in 1985 when that was a lot of money. And I got another 100 from one of those investors a year later. sweetie, you want to sit over here? There's a chair.
It's so sweet.
So we got $950 million, for having no capability other than, general knowledge. That was pretty good. Oh, that's okay. So we actually started investing, and the third investment we had, one of the younger partners are always right. They're in their 30s. So he came in and had a steel distribution company that, he knew and had worked with, and he wanted to buy it, and it was $330 million, and so he had a good story. And then, we were a small firm at that point. It almost feels like a law firm. And one of the other partners basically heard the deal was going on. There were no processes. And he walks into my office and he said, I think this thing is like a disaster in the making. It's a steel distribution company, so the more their sales are growing, and commodity prices go up, they're just selling out old, cheap inventory, making artificial profits. And when the commodity cycle turns and steel prices go down, they'll be selling plenty of stuff, but everything will be a huge loss and the company will go bankrupt. We won't be able to pay our principal and interest. Don't buy it. So I being, the great natural leader I am, I had these two people come in and sit in front of my desk. They each had a chair. And the first guy, is pitching his heart out. There are no pieces of paper. This is what's called malpractice. Malpractice. No pieces of paper. Some guy talking at me, telling me what a great thing it is. The other guy saying, well, I think it's a bad thing. He didn't have any pieces of paper. I'm listening. I'm behind the desk. I'm making pretend I'm King Solomon. So I picked the guy who talked more, which was the first guy who had more knowledge because he knew the company. And 3 months later, after we bought it, we couldn't pay our principal and interest. So, this was like a complete crisis. And we put more money in to save the company. Then that money was in jeopardy. We finally sold the company. I sold the company to a French steel company. And we lost all of our original money. We saved the extra money. We protected the bank debt. And soon after, I got a phone call from one of our investors. You never want to get a phone call from an investor after you've lost their money, because you don't need a lot of imagination to know how that meeting's going to go, right? Even if you've never been at one, you can figure it out. It wasn't meant to be a congratulatory meeting. So this guy was up Noyac on the Hudson, running an insurance company. So I went in and I sat, it's a little reversed. I was the person in the front of the desk. Sit down. He was very pleasant until he started screaming at me. I was the dumbest. You fill in the curse words, and he just kept going. The more he was screaming, the more enthusiastic he was. And I'm sitting, in front of him, and he wasn't asking for any explanation. He was broadcasting, and in my family, nobody ever raised their voice. And I didn't realize that was odd until I met roommates at college, because their families work differently. But I'm very sensitive to sound. And when somebody's screaming, I hear it, like multiples of what it really is. And I was sitting there, my face is getting red and hot, and I realized I was going to start crying. Because I was just so ashamed that I was the person in charge, and I made this horrific decision, and this money was lost. And so after what seemed to be a lifetime, but probably wasn't, the meeting was over. He had accomplished his objective. I walked out in the parking lot, and it was a beautiful day in autumn, and they had all the colored leaves on the trees, and it was brilliant, and the light was bouncing, off the river, and had a cab waiting for me, and I said, this is never gonna happen again in my life. I'm never gonna lose money. I'm never gonna have another meeting like this. And, you know, so to do that objective, we had to change everything we did, everything.
And you talk about psychological insight. That's when you talk about how you want to perceive, I think, the people in the room that present the investment.
I don't know about psychological insight. When you start things, you have to be prepared to take beatings. And you know, it's like unbelievably painful to go through a process like this, but there's no other way, right? So you know, we came up with this wonderful process that's worked. When you say we never lose money, we obviously never worked on a fund with yours where we lost any money. And you know, we basically, you know, on our private products, we almost never lose money. I mean, our whole real estate business, which is the biggest in the world, I think we've had losses of 0.1%. I mean, it's sort of surreal. And the way you do that is, you know, first of all, everybody, I mean, this is almost embarrassing to say this with a group of lawyers, but you have to write everything down. It has to be given to you 2 days ahead so you can actually have time to read it and absorb it. There has to be, among other things in that thorough memo, you have to have a list of the risk factors. And you know, you have a meeting with a committee. Most committees don't work well. There's usually one smart person who's asking all the questions and controlling the meeting, and the rest of the people, I call them paid audiences. In other words, you're paying them compensation and they're just watching. Who needs them? I don't need people to watch, you know, a smart person. Just let the smart person do it. But the interesting issue is these other people are smart too. So what you want is at every meeting, everybody has to speak. And you go around the table and you can't hide. And your job is to de-risk that investment. It's to bring up any risk that you see that hasn't been discussed. And what we do is we take each one of those variables, and it doesn't matter how many they put on a list. It's only, you know, 1, 2, or 3 of them that ever matter. The rest of them, you know, are just sort of like in the weeds, and they cancel each other out. And then if they happen, it doesn't matter anyhow. So spend your time really just on the big 1 or 2 or 3, and make sure they're not correlated, or if they are, you know, how correlated. And then you take and you debate each person, sort of gives their views on what they think the range of outcomes could be, and what probability will that happen. And so you have this discussion, and inevitably you learn something that nobody else, you know, put on the table. Somebody at that table is really smart. They're going to look at the thing differently. So by the time you do that, then you have a list of further questions. You send the team back, and then they do the same thing again, and sometimes 3 times. By the time you finish this, every risk has been thoroughly discussed, the range of outcomes, and everybody sort of comes to a general agreement, because it's just done by force of argument, reason, not the you know, the amplitude. And you know, you'll get that right answer, and inevitably what happens is that usually takes care of 80 to 90% of the risk on the deal. There are always acts of God that you can't put in, but if you get rid of 80 to 90% of the risk, and if you never go forward unless you think you're not going to lose money, guess what? You won't end up losing money. I mean, it's not a big brain here. Right, so imagine a world where you, it's like a sports team where you're always getting on base if you're playing baseball, and you know, the other team never even gets a chance to bat. And you know, if you buy an asset, and our job is to improve the operations of an asset so it grows faster than, you know, the economy, or faster than the S&P average, and you put it on leverage after you're growing faster. What will happen is you'll end up earning double the stock market average. So if you earn double the stock market average, and you start with nothing, no assets, you can end up as like a grown-up like us with $554 billion of assets. So that's a lot. So the reason we got a lot is that we do what I say,
And people say, would I rather have double the return or would I rather have less? And after a few decades, they give up and they say, just take the money, right? But the core of it is taking that first mistake and say, okay, how do I design an optimum system? And not to make the whole meeting about this, but there are two other people who are really terrific in the money management business, built giant businesses. One is Ray Dalio at Bridgewater. And if you read his book, he almost wiped himself off the planet, when he was in his 30s. And he just threw aside everything he was doing, figured out how to do it differently. There's a guy named Jim Simons at Renaissance. Jim's averaged, I think it's like 39% compounded his career. And he almost wiped himself off the planet, abandoned everything he was doing, figured it out. So I look at it that each of the three of us, and I'm not speaking for them, I just happen to know them, and I know after reading their book exactly why they were successful. If they would have had normal success, they never would have thrown everything away and invented a system that in their part of the money management business works remarkably well, not just for one market cycle, but for a whole career.
To go back towards the beginning of your book, you start the book with your childhood in Philadelphia, and you help your father in his linen store fold handkerchiefs. And you write in the book that during the 4 years as an employee, I evolved from a grumpy child into an argumentative teenager. That gives me hope as a mother, to be honest with you.
Maybe all teenagers are argumentative.
Then you say that you couldn't master the art of folding handkerchiefs, but then you noticed that your father's business was very successful, that it has potential, so you told him that he should expand. Your father said no. I want to talk more about it, but I also am very interested about, you have a couple of sentences about your mother in the book, and you say that in a different era, she would have been a CEO of a big company. So I was hoping to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, my mother was a real piece of work. There was no doubt about
yes.
it.
Yes.
My wife just confirmed that. Yeah, she was quite something. And, very, very aggressive person, very directed. My dad was really a sweetheart and, very smart. But not very aggressive. So the incident you're talking about is, we had to work at the store during Christmas time, and so they put me in the place where I could do the least damage, like in a horseshoe kind of, sort of place where we had, sort of linen handkerchiefs on different shelves, and ladies would come in, and I'd be standing in the back, and they'd point at a box of handkerchiefs where the top was off, and so I'd pull them out of the shelf and put them, on the counter, and then they'd like touch the different linen handkerchiefs, and sometimes they'd buy them, and sometimes they wouldn't. It was bad news for me if they would buy one, because then I'd have to try and wrap it up. Nobody ever taught me how to wrap anything, and I'm not good with my hands anyhow. And, I did that for years, and I never got promoted. I asked my grandfather, I was making 10 cents an hour. I asked my grandfather, who owned the store with my dad, for 25, I thought I deserved 25 cents an hour. And my grandfather looked at me, he said, Stephen, why do you think you're even worth 10 cents? So that was the end of my raise, aspirations. And, but there were a lot of people in the store, and, I was probably 13, something, maybe 14. So I said to my dad, Dad, we should probably take this store, which looked like Bed Bath & Beyond, except there was no Bed Bath & Beyond, right? So I said, why don't we expand this all over the country? I said, I think this could really work. And my dad said, I don't think this is like a great idea. So I figured, I don't know what was wrong with him, but you know, maybe he wanted something closer to home. So I said, well, why don't we expand all over Pennsylvania, because I was from Philadelphia. So he said, I don't want to do that. I said, so then I figured he really doesn't want to travel. So I said, why don't we open 6 or 7 stores around Philadelphia? And he said, I don't want to do that. So I said, Dad, what's the problem? He said, well, I'm actually very happy the way I am. I've got a house, I've got 2 cars, I have enough money to send you and your brothers to college, and that's all I want. I said, why is that like all you want? He said, because I'm happy with that, and I don't need more. And if we open stores all over, he said, I'm already working 6.5 days a week. He said, I can't work harder. And he said, there's nothing I want out of that. So I sort of like, I had trouble sort of understanding why something that was there, you know, somebody did start Bed Bath & Beyond, and it was all over. And for a long time, it was very successful. I thought it was easy. But I learned that not everybody's the same. Even when you have a great opportunity, some people just won't go for it. I learned that a lot of people simply don't want to change, and it's their nature. And then there are others of us, you know, who dream and like the concept of adventure. We're not worried about failing because there it is, it's working. I mean, you don't even have to invent it. How smart do you have to be, right? I mean, there it is. Go do it. But that was a quizzical moment for me. I love my dad, and that didn't affect my relationship with him at all. You know, I learned something. We were different. I was more like my mom.
Speaking of your ambition, you're also a very hardcore athlete. And you write in the book that there was a race where you tore your hamstring, and then you continued running with the pain so that your team can win, and or at least you give them as much advantage as you can. You also run during the bitter cold in the winter while others were resting, and you always pushed, and even you say that sometimes you vomited after working out, after training, and then yet you continued going. I'm wondering how this experience, this athletic experience, translated later into building back Blackstone.
I don't know. I think there's just a will to win and a joy of competing, and there's just something wonderful about beating everybody. And it's a very elemental, type of feeling. And in athletics, it's like easily expressed. And I trained really hard because the coach wanted it, and that's what it took to win. So if that's what it takes to win, and you're in the hands of somebody who's really, sort of astonishingly capable. My coach in high school won 186 meets, lost 4. So you realize this had nothing to do with the kids on the team. Had to do 100% with the coach who could make anybody into a winner. And so when you're working with somebody like that and they tell you, here's what I want you to do for training, and it's gonna just destroy you, you just do it. And he was a very funny guy and a lovely man. When you were running by him, he'd say something like, some of this, like, we trained in the dead of winter. I was so cold, and you know, there was ice, you know, where we were training, so you could really hurt yourself. And you go by him, and he'd be all bundled up with, you know, like the watch cap and the scarf and the sweatsuit, and he'd say, you know, you got to make some deposits in training so you can make withdrawals on game day. And I so look forward to competing because the actual meets were so easy, because it was like a third of a training day. So it was like a day off. And all you had to do was beat somebody. And we were so well trained. You know, we won the state championship. We were 4th in the United States in the AAU sprint championships. I mean, we weren't just like a high school team. We would train with Villanova sometime when they were like tops in the NCAAs. I mean, this was like just doing stuff at such a level that, you know, how could you find that a problem? But, you know, what you do learn is, you know, that extra bit that makes you into a champion it requires superhuman effort. And if you don't give it, somebody else is going to. And, you know, that becomes habit forming. You have to have it in you. Nobody can make you do that. But if you have it in you and you have a great coach and great teammates, because it's fun to be around people who are similarly demented. Right? I mean, it's a similar delusion. And, you know, you're around people like you. And they don't have to have the same intellectual, you know, sort of equipment. You know, they come in all kinds of different, you know, sort of backgrounds and so forth, but, you know, that kind of thing just creates a unity that actually lasts a lifetime.
You also had a lot of courage, and the book is full with your description of the things you did, which feels a lot, very inspiring. You also, when you applied to college, you were not accepted at Harvard. You were waitlisted. And right.
Here you are.
This is the right audience, right? So you are accepted at Yale, but for you that wasn't good enough. You had an obsession with Harvard, and it had to be Harvard. So what you did is you called the dean of Harvard University and told him, look, you're making a mistake. I'm going to be very successful. You have to accept me. And later on, you had at HBS, you had kind of similar experience when you noticed that the curriculum wasn't optimal, that there is need to improvement, how HBS should teach and educate students. So you again went to the dean and you gave him your insights, you proposed solutions, and that's the other thing, you always go with solutions. The dean looked at you and said, Mr. Schwarzman, have you always been a misfit? Did you feel a misfit? And how did you find the courage to change things, to try to change things?
Yeah, I've never found it a problem to go to people who are in charge when something's not working right and bringing it to their attention you know, suggesting how they fix it up, because I think that's why people are in those positions, right? You know, evidently that's not what everybody does. But getting into Harvard was really, that was right in character. You know, I was on the waiting list, and you know, the people in this group are of mixed ages, but some of us remember when there were no cell phones and there were pay phones, and that's the only way you could make a call if you were out of your house. And so, you know, I took a bag of quarters and put these, so I wanted to call the dean of admissions, and so I found the number in like some book, you know, for the Harvard admissions office, and you know, so I put these. I was in the gym my high school, and I started putting quarters in. And for those who've never used a payphone, it makes noise when you put them in. It goes like cha-ching, it's like,
Yes.
it's acknowledging that you put your quarter in. And to call Boston probably cost $1.25. Like you got to put 5 of these things in, and it only got you 3 minutes, and then you had to put another thing in. So I just called and I said, Dean so and so, and they just put me through. The guy picks up the phone, and I said, "Hi, this is Steve Schwarzman from Abington High School in Abington, Pennsylvania." He said, "Yes." I said, "I'm calling because I'm on the waiting list, and I'd like to be admitted to Harvard College." So he said, "Who are you?" He said, "You're not allowed to talk to me." He said, "I don't talk to students that were applicants." I said, "Apparently you do, because I'm talking to you." And I said, "I'd really like to go to Harvard." I said, "I think I'm going to be very successful. You'll be happy to have me at Harvard." So he said, "Well, you sound like a very nice young man, but I'm not going to be able to help you because our yield this year was so high. We're not taking anyone off the waiting list." He said, "So where did you get admitted?" He said, "I got admitted to Yale, among other places." He said, "Well, you'll find Yale very congenial. I'm sure you'll have a good time there." I said, "I wasn't worried about having a good time." I was just worried about getting into Harvard. He said, "Well, I'm really sorry, I can't help you." So if you ever do things like this, that's completely out of your comfort zone, you find yourself covered with perspiration. And this is like talking to God. It's like calling God, the Dean of Admissions at Harvard, and he's talking to you. I mean, this is like really for a high school kid, for a public high school. It's really, takes a lot to do that. So the funny story ending on this is that like 30 years later, I had a visit from the head of some big company who was doing some work for us, and he was on the Harvard Corporation, which I guess at that point they had like 6 or 8 people on it, the people who actually run Harvard, not the overseers, but people who actually run it. So I told him this story, and he said, "Geez, was that Dean so-and-so in 1965? I said, "Yeah, it was." He said, "Well, he's a really good friend of mine. And would you mind if I told him about this story?" And I said, "No, I don't care, whatever." So 3 weeks later, I got a letter from the former dean of admissions at Harvard. "Dear Mr. Schwarzman, so-and-so talked to me and told me that I had talked to you in 1965 about getting off the waiting list." He said, "I remember that phone call. It's the only time I've ever talked to an applicant during that season. And I remember telling you that we couldn't admit you, and you telling me that you were going to be very successful." He said, "I've been thinking about you for at least 20 years because I keep reading about you in newspapers. And every time I see you, I realize I made a mistake. And the mistake keeps getting bigger and bigger." So he said, the problem of being like Dean of Admissions is it's hard to know with a 17-year-old, what's going to happen. So we do the best we could. He said, "It's pretty clear we blew it, yes, regards to you." And, so I read it and I said, "Okay." Well, there we square that circle with, the head of Harvard Business School. That was particularly, bad situation. It was during Vietnam. Business was exceptionally unpopular, and all the smart kids went to Harvard Law School, Harvard Medical School, Yale Law School. I couldn't get into any law school, so I got stuck at Harvard Business School. Talk about how you have a career defined. Nobody wanted me. Okay, so I go to Harvard Business School, and it was terrible because all the smart kids were, at the law school, and so I became a smart kid, and I never was like the smart kid. right? So that meant the smart kids just were elsewhere. I never thought I might have an aptitude for business, but I looked at it in a more traditional way. And at that point, the school was just poorly run and so forth. So I got an appointment with the dean. It took me months, and I told him, I said, I think there's some things you should know. And he said, what's that? He said, I said, you have teachers who can't teach. You've got students who can't learn. You've got an outmoded curriculum. And the administrative apparatus at the school doesn't work. And here's how you fix each one of those. And he's listening, doesn't say a word. So he finishes, I finished, and he said, Mr. Schwarzman, have you always been a misfit? And I said, actually, Dean Foraker, not really. I said, I was president of my junior high school, president of my high school, the speaker at graduation at Yale. I'm the head of your most prestigious student organization, if you bothered to even look, which you didn't. And no, I'm not a misfit. I'm trying to help you. He said, I don't think we need any help. So I realized, here's the problem. I'm sitting right in front of it. And I said, you're the #1 ranked business school now in the country. I said, I'm really sorry, but I think, you're going to become much lower in the rankings unless you fix all these things. He said, well, thank you for your views. Basically, I've had enough of you. So I left. Harvard went from #1 to #7. And then they got, 2 deans down. They got a great guy named Kim Clark, calls me up. He said, Steve, will you join whatever the visiting committee was? Those schools really very tough times. We need to fix it up. I need your views. So, now they're back to whatever they're back to. #1, #2 with Stanford or whatever. But one person can really make a complete mess if they're a bad leader. This was a bad leader. I have no trouble showing up, telling people if I think there's a problem that I can demonstrate. It wasn't an opinion. I can give like infinite examples of what the problem is. You never want to do that without offering a whole bunch of solutions. Just to be a complainer, who needs that, right? But if you can solve all the problems, then they should be responsive. And by the way, when you do that, it's interesting, as part of this book, people keep asking me, I'm so amazed you do these things. Aren't you scared? I said, why would I be scared? I'm just helping. I'm not, just because that guy's in charge of something or that woman's in charge of something, that's their job. My job's to help them be better. If I know something they don't know, if they knew what I knew, they'd fix it,
And
right?
maybe solutions come natural.
Yeah, just a solutions person.
The same kind of thing happened at Yale back when you went there. In the beginning, you were very disappointed. You felt like completely out of place, and you write in the book that the loneliness was crushing and everything and everyone intimidated me. And you felt that your prior education kind of didn't prepare you for Yale. But you found a teaching assistant that helped you and guided you to how to improve. And you write something very interesting that I really liked reading. You say that teaching, I came to believe, is more than sharing knowledge. You have to remove the obstacles in people's ways. So how did you also turn things around at Yale?
Well, that was pretty desperate. I went to public high school. I thought it was pretty good. I was like in the Honor Society, National Merit Finalist or something. Apparently, I was a bozo because when I got to college, my first essay in English was on Bartleby the Scrivener. I don't know if you've ever read that piece of work. It's somewhat boring. But in any case, I got a 68 on that paper. so then they had another English paper, that was another Melville story, I don't know why. I got a 66 on that one. So even I could understand that this was a bad trend, starting in a bad place. So I got called in for a meeting, so this was a very junior professor, and you would know that because you were in the top floor of a building where the roof was sloping, right? So he had no stroke, so I sat down, and he said, "Well, Mr. Schwarzman, we're here to talk about your English papers." So I said, "Actually, there's really not anything to talk about." He said, "Well, why would that be?" I said, "Because I had nothing to say, and I said it poorly." He said, "By God, you're not stupid." He said, "You don't know how to think, and you don't know how to write." He said, "So first, I'll teach you how to write, because you can't think and write at the same time, right? So I'll give you the answer to the next essay or two, and I'll teach you how to write. And after you learn how to write, then I'll teach you how to think." And it did. And so, by the end of the first year, I was on Dean's list. But, I went to a public high school. We had 950 people in the class. I was somewhere between number 32 and 38. The only problem is I was in class with those other 38 people. So I was like at the bottom of every class I was in, except I was, like in the smart kids class. But, it didn't matter, the other 920 people. All that mattered is you were in class with people who were always smarter. So I didn't have much of a sense I was a smart person. And this guy saved me. If he hadn't done that, I don't know that I would have made it. And so one person, and when I was writing the book, I actually tried to find this guy. And it was really interesting that, I've given some money to Yale, so they like me. The president of Yale said, "Oh, we'll find this person for you." And so they looked at the syllabus for that year, he wasn't on it. So they gave me one or two names. I said, "No, I don't remember, those couldn't be the names." So they had a very difficult time finding who this could have been. And the guy was a research assistant at the Beinecke Library. And somebody in the English department, because he didn't have enough money, asked him if he'd teach a section of freshman English. I guess it doesn't get lower than that. And they pay him something. So he wasn't even on the books of the official thing, that you print, whatever that catalog is, to choose your courses. So I found this guy. He's now, I guess, somewhere in his mid-80s in Scotland, someplace, because he was British. And I wrote him a letter. And he said, "Oh yes, I remember you." I guess you don't get that many Yale students again in 68 and 66. And he said, "Yes," he said, "I remember that worked out very well." And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, he said, I'm still teaching up here at some university in Scotland. I mean, so you never know what happens in life, the people you accidentally intersect and how they impact your life. This was like really important for me. And that's why writing a book is so painful. By the way, this book is really good.
It is really good.
And it's very funny. Okay?
It
It's
is
funny and it's quick read. And it's very informative and people love it. It's a bestseller.
And it's going to be even better.
And it's on the Amazon Best Books of 2019, and you should buy it. Okay? They've got some free ones, but if you read it and you love it, then you can go on Amazon or you can go to Barnes and Noble, whatever you do, and buy one, for a brother or sister or your parents. or your stupid roommate who never made it, you can buy them, and people do. And what's amazing to me is they buy them a lot, and they, people of a certain age, they give them to their children, because nobody knows how to deal with children, particularly about careers and how you live in the real world. If you're a father, as a father, and I'm a father, and you start talking to your teenage son or daughter about it, their eyes just glaze over. They don't want to hear from you for whatever, the reasons that a psychologist would tell you they don't want to hear from you, but you can buy them a book. And I now get emails from these kids saying, my father or my mother gave me your book, I love it, and here's why I love it. And that, those people can be in their 30s. They don't have to be teenagers. So the book barely costs anything. Everything's so discounted in Amazon. I think it's like $20 or something. So, instead of having a slice of pizza, you can buy a book.
I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about Schwarzman Scholars, because I think it's very important. Your education is very important to you. That was trying to link it to Yale a little bit. You say in the book that the idea about Schwarzman Scholars came because you were to meet President Chen, and you said you were looking for an inspiration, and you wanted to make sure that you create a university where you can give young people the ability to not only get good education, but also to learn about Chinese culture. So it would be really great to hear more about this.
Yeah, you all went to a university. One thing that's the same with universities all around the world, they really love raising money, right? And if you have more money, they like you even more. And so I'm in that latter pile, and I got involved with a Chinese university because the government of China bought 9.9% of my company Blackstone's IPO without us asking them. They just showed up and wanted to give us $3 billion. I don't know how many times you've had that experience in life, where somebody you don't know says, I'd like to give you $3 billion for a $4 billion IPO. These are people you could learn to like. So we took their money, added it to the others, and it was the second biggest IPO of the decade, first decade of this century, second to Google. And I got put on the board of the Tsinghua School of Economic and Management International Advisory Board. So they were having their 100th anniversary a few years after I went on. Anytime there's any anniversary at a university, they will come to you to raise money. It's a great excuse. Doesn't matter if they're Chinese, whether they're American, there's always an excuse for a capital drive, right? So they came to see me right in the midst of the global financial crisis. Apparently they didn't get the word that the average financial stock was down 85%. In our case, we were always an outperformer, so we were down 90. This was not exactly the perfect timing. So I said no, and they went away. But universities never really go away. So they changed the president. So the new president, a few years later, he said, look, okay, the stock market was up a bit, there's more money, let's go see this guy. And my wife and I were living in Paris. So I got emails saying, President Chen wants to come and see you in Paris. For Chinese, it's not like, other countries. You just don't get on a plane and go to Paris if you're working, for a university or the government. You need permissions.
Oh, yeah.
Usually not just one person. You need multiple permissions to take that trip. So his saying, "I'll come to Paris to see you," was really very awful, because that meant it wasn't just him. There were other people expecting me to do something. So he showed up, and before he showed up, I knew, I figured out what the drill was, and I said, okay. At first, they suggested a few years earlier a student exchange. I thought that was pretty boring, because there were always student exchanges. Like, who cares? I like doing things that tend to be unique and sort of impactful and big. It's just sort of like a disease. I like that. I like that stuff. So I realized I had to come up with something. So I said, look, he said, Steve, what would you like to do? I said, well, there's a problem I want to address, which is the increase in populism in the West, particularly in the United States, and usually populism, has people who've been wronged or believe they've been wronged, and they get angry, and then somebody gets elected to whip them up. And by whipping them up, they get even more angry, but you don't solve their problems. And then what happens is they get angry. First they typically go after business people, wealthy people, financial people, and when that doesn't give them satisfaction, then they find a foreign devil, right? So the foreign devil is going to be China. Why? Because that's where the jobs were going, that's where the money was going, and so I was totally convinced that China would be the target for American populism. And I said, I'd like to do something that sort of deals with this issue and takes people from around the world, including America, and sends them to China, go to school with some Chinese, but basically, use this as a mechanism to learn about China, meet the leaders of the country, go around and see things, have a mentor who's a prominent person, so they can go to people's houses and sort of see how they live, work to some degree at whether it's a ministry or a not-for-profit or Chinese corporation. So if we take a year, give them a master's degree, and really saturate them with China, then the objective is for this group of future leaders to go back to their own countries, do whatever they would normally do, and be able to interpret China for people in their country, and also feed back to China when they were doing something wrong, so that China will change and not just stay on the same course. And I looked at this as a version, sort of an adaptation of what the Rhodes was trying to do. But the Rhodes was basically just doing it for some ex-British colonies, taking people to Oxford. I wanted to take them to China, but have no restrictions. Basically we built like an Oxbridge College, and people live there, and they take classes there, and they do all the things that I've said. It's the most extraordinary group of people I've ever been around. We accept around 3% of the students that apply. Harvard's like 5.5, but our biggest feeder is Harvard. So we're getting 3% of the 5.5. So this is, these people are surreal. We have about 140 of them now. We're slowly building up to 200. And steady state, we'll have about 14,000 of these people. Depends on lifespan. And this will be a group, one of the most extraordinary people around the world, in touch with each other, because you can do that now with the internet. When I graduated, I didn't see anybody from my class for like 5 years, then I saw them once and I went, let's not do that again, right? But here you can do it all the time. We're having reunions after 3 months. The kids live together after they graduate. They call them Schwarz houses. It's embarrassing, and we got that in New York, Washington, Boston, San Francisco, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, London. And they're in constant touch with each other. It's the most astonishing thing. The final thing I'll tell you about these people, that it's 40% American, 40% rest of world, 20% China. We have 41 countries, representatives of kids, and 109 universities. The first year we only had 110 kids. Tsinghua University has 44,000 kids. I mean, this is like, and it's the most selective university in China, which means this is like really selective. We have no athletic requirement for Schwarzman scholars. The Rhodes in the old days, had an athletic requirement. So I'm sitting at home one night watching Law and Order. My wife's doing her own reading, and get a phone call from somebody, in China saying, "Steve, you're not going to believe this." I said, "Well, it could always be something wrong." So I said, "Believe what?" He said, "We just won the university track and field championship." I said, "We what?" 110 people. We beat 44,000 people. I said, "This isn't possible." They said, no, this is happening. Here, I'm going to email you a picture of the trophy. So, okay. Like a month later, I get another call. "Steve, we've won the men's soccer championship. And in December, we won the women's basketball championship." Now imagine 110 people and who they must be with no athletic requirement, beating everybody. And that's just in the athletic area. I mean, the whole creativity of this group of people. Whenever my wife and I go there, I go for graduation, I go for first day of school, I talk to them at Christmas, I show up. And it's so dazzling to be around people like this, that it's a real privilege for me to be associated with it and facilitate it. So you can do things in your life as you get older sometimes that are like they just sort of happen. You invent them, you do them. It's not easy to be successful in China. I couldn't have done it. I got President Obama, did some stuff for him. And he wrote a letter of endorsement. He asked me, I saw him at something, and he said, "Hey Steve, how's it going?" I said, "It's going." He said, "What are you up to?" I said, "I'm starting this thing in China." He said, "Boy, that sounds great." He said, "What can I do to help you?" I said, "You can do a video, or you can do a letter." He said, "Okay, I'll do whatever you want." He said, "Just talk to Valerie and I'll do it for you." So I got a letter, and we got to China, and I knew, slow as I am, if you have a letter from the President of the United States for a program in China, and you give that letter to the President of China, you're going to get an answer. So we got it to President Xi. So he was just like a new president. He just had started. So he wrote an endorsement. So I had endorsement of China. In China, this is a big deal. In America, presidents are nice, they're easy. If you're doing something, they'll help you. In China, it does not work that way. So to have the president of China say, "This is a great thing," that means we could actually accomplish the things we wanted. If he had not been supportive, we never could have done this. It's impossible to do something like this in China as a startup at their #1 university. I mean, it's just like, I didn't even realize how crazy what I was doing was, but in effect, we got rescued. And now it's like known all over the world, in the academic world and also in China. So I give you that long story because this is like a group that has an academic base, at least you used to be there. And it's just so exciting to do some of these things. But I should let you go to dinner. And for the people who are standing, a special thank you. For surviving. I see some of you leaning against walls, so it wasn't.
An expensive painting.
Well, I thought this was like a present for speaking.
That would be a good idea. Well, thank you. Not only thank you for coming, but thank you for all your contributions to education and philanthropy and now artificial intelligence. But thank you, really. We appreciate your book and everything you do.
Thank you.